The call came at 5:17 on a Tuesday morning. I'd been staring at the ceiling for hours anyway, trapped in that familiar half-sleep that had become my normal since retirement. The phone's vibration against the nightstand was almost a relief. "Reynolds," I answered, my voice still thick with the night. "It's Dale." The familiar gruff tone of my former captain needed no introduction. "I know you're done with all this, but we've got something unusual. Need your eyes on it." 6 months into retirement and already being pulled back, I should have said no. I'd promised myself I would. "Where?" I asked instead. "Pinecrest, about 3 hours north, isolated cabin in the woods." Dale paused. "Local PD is out of their depth. Said it's the worst they've seen." I'd heard that before. Small-town cops calling in help for what usually turned out to be a standard homicide. Tragic, but straightforward. Still, Dale wouldn't call if it wasn't something more. "I'll be there by noon," I said, already swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "I owe you one, Reynolds. Add it to your tab." The drive gave me too much time to think. The mountains rose around me as I headed north, the morning fog clinging to the pines like something unwilling to let go. I'd left behind 30 years of blood and brutality for fishing trips and afternoons reading books I'd been putting off. Yet here I was, driving towards someone else's nightmare because I couldn't fully cut the cord. Pinecrest wasn't even a proper town, just a cluster of buildings servicing the hunting cabins and summer homes scattered throughout the surrounding wilderness. The local police station was a single-story brick building that looked like it handled more lost hikers than violent crime. Officer Briggs met me in the parking lot. Young guy, maybe early 30s, with a mustache that seemed to be compensating for something. His handshake was firm but clammy. "Thanks for coming, Detective Reynolds," he said, eyes darting to the ground. "We've secured the scene, but, well, you'll see." "Not a detective anymore," I reminded him, retrieving my kit from the trunk. Old habits. I'd packed it automatically, gloves, booties, basic tools. Just helping out Captain Dale. Briggs led me to his patrol car. "It's about 20 minutes out, dirt road most of the way." As we drove, I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "First responders?" I asked. "Me and 2 others. Anonymous call to dispatch about screaming from the old Henson property." Briggs swallowed. "Hensons haven't owned it for years, though. Current residents moved in about 3 years ago, kept to themselves." The cabin appeared through the trees after we'd been bouncing down an overgrown road for what felt like forever. Nothing special. 2 stories of weathered logs with a stone chimney, surrounded by pines. A few other officers milled around outside, their faces carrying that hollow look I recognized all too well. The smell hit me before I even reached the porch. Anyone who's worked homicide knows that smell. Death with time to ripen. But this was more concentrated, more deliberate than a typical murder scene. Briggs handed me a jar of mentholated ointment. I dabbed some under my nose, a ritual that had never really worked, but we all did it anyway. "Fair warning," Briggs said quietly. "2 of our guys already puked." I nodded and stepped inside. 30 years of police work prepares you for a lot of things. It doesn't prepare you for everything. The living room looked like someone had tried to paint it red, only they'd used the wrong materials. Blood spatter covered nearly every surface: walls, ceiling, the stone fireplace. Not the chaotic spatter of a frenzied attack, but something more methodical. Blood had been spread with purpose. A male body lay sprawled near what must have been a dining area. His chest was a canyon of torn flesh, organs removed and arranged beside him in a pattern that made no logical sense. His face was largely intact, eyes open, mouth frozen in what might have been surprise. "Harold Carver," Briggs said from the doorway where he'd chosen to stay. 45. Worked odd jobs in town. Carpentry mostly. I moved carefully through the scene, my booties making soft sounds on the hardwood floor. In what appeared to be the main room, I found her, the woman. She was posed, there's no other word for it. Positioned on her knees, back arched unnaturally, head tilted toward the ceiling. Her throat had been cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated, but someone had taken the time to keep her upright, possibly with wire or fishing line I couldn't immediately see. Her face was the worst part. The cheeks had been sliced from the corners of her mouth up toward her ears, creating a grotesque parody of a smile that exposed teeth and bone. The cuts were precise, not frenzied. Someone had taken their time. "Evelyn Carver," came Briggs's voice, more distant now. "Wife." I forced myself to document every detail, taking photos with mechanical precision. Detachment is a skill you learn early or you don't last in homicide. Still, something about the woman's carved face made my stomach clench in a way it hadn't in years. The children were upstairs, a boy and a girl, both teenagers from the look of them, though it was hard to be certain. They'd been positioned on their beds, bodies relatively intact except for the fact that their heads were missing. I found those arranged on a dresser between the two small bedrooms, facing each other as if in conversation. Michael, 14. Marissa, 16. Briggs supplied from the hallway. His voice had the flat quality of someone pushing through shock. I continued my documentation, noting details without letting myself process the full horror yet. That would come later, probably around 3 a.m. when I tried to sleep. As I worked my way back downstairs, I noticed something odd about the air current in the main room. The front door was closed, as were all the windows I'd checked, yet there was a persistent, subtle draft. I followed it to the stone fireplace, large enough to walk into if you ducked your head. The draft was coming from behind the fireplace grate. I moved it aside and directed my flashlight into the darkness. The back wall of the fireplace wasn't solid stone but had a rectangular opening, a small door about 3 feet high. "Briggs," I called, "did your team check behind the fireplace?" His footsteps approached hesitantly. "No, sir. We documented the main crime scene and secured the perimeter. Waited for someone with more experience." Making sure my gloves were secure, I pulled the small door open. It revealed a narrow passage with crude steps leading down. The smell that wafted up was different from the carnage upstairs. More feral, like unwashed bodies and human waste. "I need a stronger light," I said. Briggs handed me a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt. "You're going down there?" he asked, voice tight. "That's why Dale called me." I didn't wait for his response. The passage was cramped, forcing me to hunch over as I descended. The stairs gave way to a dirt floor in what appeared to be a crudely dug basement or cellar. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough stone walls lined with shelves holding jars of unidentifiable contents. And then I saw it. A large cage made of welded metal bars, no more than 5 feet high and 6 feet square, positioned against the far wall. Inside was a shape, human, barely. I approached slowly, my light revealing more details I immediately wished I couldn't see. A young man, probably in his 20s though it was hard to tell, lay curled in the fetal position on the dirt floor of the cage. He was completely naked, his body a canvas of filth, dried blood and wounds in various stages of healing. Ribs protruded sharply through his skin, and patches of his hair were missing, revealing scalp wounds. When my light hit his face, he flinched and made a low sound in his throat, turning away and covering his eyes. He was alive. "I need medical down here now," I shouted toward the stairs. "We have a survivor." Moving closer to the cage, I crouched down. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Marcus Reynolds. I'm with the police. You're safe now." The young man's eyes cracked open, unusual amber color sunken deep in their sockets. He looked at me with such raw fear that it hit me like a physical blow. "Help is coming," I told him. "We're going to get you out of here." His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, managing a raspy whisper I had to lean in to hear. "Are they dead?" I hesitated only briefly. "Yes. They can't hurt you anymore." Something shifted in his expression then. Not relief exactly, but something more complicated that I couldn't read. The next hour was controlled chaos. Paramedics arrived with bolt cutters for the cage, which was secured with a heavy padlock. They worked carefully to stabilize the young man, who remained mostly unresponsive except for occasional flinches when touched. An IV line was started immediately for fluids and emergency nutrition. They wrapped his emaciated body in thermal blankets before strapping him to a stretcher. "Severe malnutrition," one of the paramedics told me. "Multiple infected wounds, signs of repeated trauma. It's a miracle he's alive." I watched as they carried him up the narrow stairs and out of that hell. "Did he say anything else?" Briggs asked, looking slightly less pale now that he had something to focus on besides the carnage. "No," I replied, "but we'll need to talk to him once he's stabilized. He's our only witness." The rest of the day blurred into the familiar routine of evidence collection. Crime scene techs arrived from the nearest city. The coroner made preliminary assessments. Photos were taken, measurements recorded, bodies eventually removed in thick black bags. By nightfall, I found myself standing alone on the cabin's porch. The forest around me had gone silent in that way that feels deliberate, as if the natural world was holding its breath in the presence of such human depravity. I'd seen a lot in 3 decades of police work: serial killings, murder-suicides, the brutal aftermaths of domestic disputes gone horrifically wrong. But something about this scene felt different, like I was looking at the surface evidence of something deeper and more systematic than a typical homicide. The carved smile on Evelyn Carver's face kept appearing when I closed my eyes. The meticulous arrangement of the children's heads, the cage in the basement that spoke of long-term captivity and torture. None of it fit the patterns I was familiar with. As I walked back to Briggs' patrol car for the ride back to town, I knew with absolute certainty that this case would follow me long after I returned to my interrupted retirement. Some crime scenes leave an imprint, like a hand pressed into wet cement. This one had grabbed hold with fingers that wouldn't easily let go. I'd spent the past 3 days in and out of the Pinecrest Regional Hospital, splitting my time between witness interviews and checking on our survivor. The smell of antiseptic hit me anew each time I entered, never quite masking the underlying scent of illness and medication. Today marked my 4th visit to Neil Simmons' room. The doctors had finally cleared him for a longer conversation, though they'd warned me to keep it brief. His chart hanging at the foot of his bed showed slight improvements in his vitals, but the numbers meant little compared to what I saw before me. Neil lay propped against white pillows, his skin almost the same shade. IVs snaked into both arms, delivering the nutrients his body had been starved of for years. His amber eyes tracked my movements as I settled into the chair beside him. Those eyes were the only vibrant thing about him, alert and wary in his hollow face. "How are you feeling today?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. Neil's cracked lips parted. "Better," he whispered, though the word sounded like it scraped his throat raw. "They gave me pudding." The small plastic cup sat untouched on his tray. I noticed how his fingers occasionally twitched toward it, then retreated, as if he was struggling with the concept of freely available food. "That's good. You need to build your strength." I leaned forward slightly, careful to maintain enough distance not to crowd him. "Do you feel up to talking a bit more today?" He gave a barely perceptible nod. "I've been building a timeline," I said, pulling out my notebook instead of immediately peppering him with questions. "The forensics team has identified the family who held you. The Carvers, Harold, Evelyn, and their children, Michael and Marissa." At the mention of their names, Neil's fingers clutched at the thin hospital blanket. His breathing quickened. "They're dead," I reminded him gently. "They can't hurt you anymore." He swallowed visibly. "I know. You told me that. In the basement." "That's right." I noted his reaction. "Neil, we've been working to understand what happened to you. The medical team says you've been subjected to severe malnutrition and..." I paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound clinical or detached. "And prolonged torture. They found evidence of repeated trauma spanning what appears to be years." Neil's gaze drifted to the window, where gray clouds pressed against the glass. 3 years, he said flatly. I counted the full moons. 36 of them. I wrote this down, a chill running through me at the precision of his count. 3 years in that cage. My mind flashed to the basement, the dirt floor, the cramped darkness, the stench of prolonged captivity. "Can you tell me how you encountered the Carvers?" I kept my voice neutral, professional. Neil closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he seemed to be looking at something far beyond the hospital walls. "I was hitchhiking through Idaho, trying to get to Portland. Had some friends there who said I could crash with them." His words came slowly, each one deliberate. I'd been walking for hours. It was getting dark, cold. They pulled over, a blue pickup. Harold was driving. Evelyn was in the passenger seat. The kids were in the back. He paused, taking a sip of water from the cup on his tray with shaking hands. They seemed normal. Nice, even. Offered me a ride. Said they had plenty of room at their place. I could get a hot meal and head out in the morning. A bitter smile twisted his lips. I thanked them for their kindness. I nodded, writing notes while maintaining eye contact. What happened next? The food tasted strange, like metallic. I started feeling dizzy. The room was spinning. I remember Evelyn stroking my hair, telling me everything would be fine if I just accepted their gift. His voice caught. I woke up in that cage. The matter-of-fact way he related this horror made it somehow worse. I'd interviewed countless victims over my career, but the quiet detachment in Neil's voice spoke to a level of trauma that went beyond anything I'd encountered. The forensics team has been digging into the Carvers' background, I said, giving him a moment to recover. They weren't always in Pinecrest. They moved around a lot. Neil's eyes sharpened with interest. They talked about that sometimes, the sacred places they'd been. Said they were called to different locations by the ones they served. We've tracked movements to 5 different states over the past 12 years, all isolated areas like Pinecrest. And in each location, people went missing. There were others. Neil's voice dropped so low I had to lean in. Before me, during my time there, I heard them. Sometimes Harold would bring them down to show me what would happen if I didn't cooperate. I steeled myself for what I needed to ask next. "Neil, Can you tell me about what they did? The doctors found evidence of specific patterns of injury. His eyes darted around the room as if checking for hidden observers. When he spoke again, his words came in a rush, like he needed to purge them. They called it receiving the smile. It was their religion, I think. They believed they were preparing vessels for what they called the smiling ones. Neil's hands began to tremble more violently. Harold would read from this book they had, leather-bound, old. He said it contained the truth that most people weren't worthy to know. I remembered the grotesque smile carved into Evelyn Carver's face, the careful arrangement of the bodies. What kind of rituals did they perform? Neil's breathing had become shallow. A nurse glanced in through the door window, clearly monitoring his stress levels. They had different ceremonies. The one they did most often was called the cleansing. They'd cut symbols into the skin, collect the blood in these ceramic bowls. His words were becoming more fragmented. The worst was the awakening. That's when they'd carve the smile. Start at the corners of the mouth, up toward the ears. Said it made room for the entity to enter. I thought of the grisly scene at the cabin, the arterial spray that had painted the walls, the carefully positioned corpses. Neil, I know this is difficult, but were the children involved in these rituals? Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Michael was being groomed to take over from his father, participated in everything. He was eager. Neil's voice hardened slightly. Marissa was different. Different how? She would sometimes help me. When the others were gone, she'd sneak down food or water, clean some of my wounds, told me she was sorry. His voice cracked on the last word. She said she wanted to help me escape, but she was afraid of what her father would do. I made careful notes, keying in on this division within the family. Did Marissa ever explain why her family did these things? Neil shook his head slightly. She said they'd always lived this way, that her parents believed they were chosen to prepare the way for the Smiling One's return, that when enough vessels were ready, their gods would come back and reward the faithful. The nurse entered then, checking Neil's vitals with a concerned expression. I think that's enough for today, she said firmly, adjusting one of his IV lines. I nodded, closing my notebook. Just one more question, if that's all right. Neil looked exhausted, but gave a small nod. Neil, Harold was reading from a specific book during these rituals. Do you know where they kept it? He closed his eyes, concentrating. There was a hollow space in their bedroom wall, behind the dresser. I overheard them talking about it once. Harold said it was the safest place for the sacred text. I stood, tucking my notebook away. Thank you, Neil. You've been incredibly helpful. I'll let you rest now. His amber eyes fixed on me with unexpected intensity. You're going back there, aren't you? To that place? Yes. We need to find that book. Be careful, he whispered. They believed the book itself was powerful, that it could influence people who weren't prepared to read it. I nodded, not dismissing his warning despite its supernatural overtones. After what Neil had endured, his concerns deserved respect, regardless of their basis in reality. Get some rest, I said. I'll check in on you tomorrow. The cabin looked different in daylight. Less menacing, more pathetic. Yellow crime scene tape created a perimeter around the property, fluttering in the mountain breeze. Local officers nodded to me as I approached, recognizing me from the past few days of investigation. Captain Dale called ahead, one of them said. Said you needed another look inside. Just following up on new information, I replied, pulling on gloves from my kit. The smell had faded somewhat, but still lingered. That distinctive mix of dried blood and death that clings to crime scenes. The bodies were long gone, but their outlines remained marked on the floor. Bloodstains had darkened to rusty brown across the wooden planks. I moved purposefully toward the master bedroom. The forensics team had thoroughly processed the scene, photographing and cataloging every detail. The room was Spartan. A double bed stripped to the mattress, a wooden dresser, a small nightstand. The tidy simplicity felt obscene given what had happened here. According to Neil, the book would be behind the dresser in a hollow wall. I examined the dresser first. Heavy oak, built to last. It stood flush against the wall, no obvious signs it had been regularly moved. That gave me pause. If the carvers accessed this book for their rituals, the dresser would show signs of frequent movement. I ran my fingers along the edges of the dresser, finding no wear marks on the floor, indicating it had been pulled out repeatedly. Neil's information seemed off. Stepping back, I surveyed the room again. What would I do if I had something precious I wanted hidden but accessible? I wouldn't put it somewhere requiring heavy furniture to be moved. My eyes tracked across the wall. The wooden paneling was uniform, except for a slight variation in color near the floor, about 2 feet to the right of the dresser. Crouching down, I ran my fingers along the baseboard. A small notch, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, caught my attention. I pressed it, feeling a slight give. A section of the baseboard swung inward, revealing a narrow cavity about 15 inches high and 2 feet wide. Reaching in with my gloved hand, I felt something wrapped in cloth. Carefully, I withdrew a package roughly the size of a large hardcover book. Unwrapping the oilcloth covering, I revealed a leather-bound volume, its cover darkened with age and what looked disturbingly like old bloodstains. No title marked its exterior, but intricate patterns had been pressed into the leather, swirling designs that seemed to shift under my gaze. I set it down on the bare mattress and opened it, half expecting to find blank pages or gibberish. Instead, neat handwriting filled the pages, interspersed with detailed drawings. The text appeared to be in English, though certain passages contained words in what might have been Latin or something older. The first page bore a single line: "The Doctrine of Eternal Smiles." Flipping through carefully, I found detailed instructions for rituals, theological ravings about entities called the Smiling Ones, and disturbing anatomical drawings showing how to properly prepare a vessel. Each page was more disturbing than the last, revealing a coherent, if utterly deranged, belief system. What struck me most wasn't the grotesque details, but the methodical organization. This wasn't the work of a random psychopath. Someone had carefully documented and structured this ideology, possibly over generations. Harold Carver hadn't invented this madness. He'd inherited it. Certain passages referenced sister families and keeper bloodlines scattered across the country, suggesting the Carvers weren't isolated in their beliefs. One page contained what looked like a list of locations with dates beside them, many matching the places we'd already connected to the Carvers' movements. I photographed every page before carefully rewrapping the book. This wasn't just evidence in a murder case anymore. It potentially linked to dozens of unsolved disappearances across multiple states. As I secured the journal in an evidence bag, my phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Dr. Kelsey from Pinecrest Regional. I thought you should know. Neil Simmons is asking for you. He's become agitated after your visit, insisting there's something else he needs to tell you, something he was too afraid to mention before." "Tell him I'm on my way," I said, glancing down at the bagged journal in my hands. "And doctor?" Make sure someone stays with him until I get there. I headed for my car, the weight of the book heavy in my hands. Whatever Neil had held back, I suspected it connected to the disturbing network outlined in these pages, a network that suggested the horror in this cabin was just one node in something much larger and more organized than we'd initially believed. The corridor stretching to Neil's hospital room seemed longer than it had a week ago. My shoulders ached from tension that hadn't left since discovering that leather-bound book. The doctrine of eternal smiles felt like a physical weight in my thoughts, its grotesque illustrations and methodical instructions lingering behind my eyelids whenever I blinked. I found Dr. Kelsey waiting outside Neil's door, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "He's been asking for you constantly," she said, her voice low. "Whatever he needs to tell you has him severely agitated. We've had to increase his sedation twice." "Has he said anything specific?" "Just that there's something he didn't tell you. Something about the children." She glanced through the narrow window into his room. "His physical recovery is progressing better than expected, but psychologically..." She trailed off, professional composure slipping for a moment. I nodded. "I'll take it from here." Neil was sitting up in bed when I entered, the hospital gown hanging loose around his still skeletal frame. A week of proper nutrition and medical care had made marginal improvements, his skin less gray, his eyes less sunken, but he remained a living testament to prolonged suffering. The hollow spaces between his bones told a story no one should have to hear. "You came back," he said, amber eyes fixing on me with unsettling intensity. "I said I would." I settled into the chair beside his bed, notebook ready. "The nurse said you were upset, that there's something else you needed to tell me." His fingers twisted in the thin blanket. "I've been remembering more, things I didn't want to talk about before. About the night of the killings." Neil nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. Rain tapped against the glass, creating tear-like tracks. "I told you some of it, but not everything. I need to tell you everything now." I gave him space to continue, the silence punctuated only by the steady beep of his heart monitor. "The Carvers, they believed they were special. Chosen." His voice had strengthened over the past week, though it still carried the rasp of someone who'd spent years screaming. Harold taught his children that their bloodline had been selected generations ago to serve entities they called the Smiling Ones. They thought these beings existed just beyond our reality, watching through special portals. "What kind of portals?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite the crawling sensation along my spine. "Mirrors, pools of water, eyes." Neil swallowed hard. "They believed the ritual cutting, the smile, created another kind of portal. That's why they did it to their victims. They weren't just killing people, they were creating doorways." I thought of the book I'd found, the detailed drawings showing precisely how to cut a human face to create what it called the eternal smile. And the children were raised in this belief system? From birth. Neil shifted uncomfortably. Michael was completely indoctrinated, eager to please his father, to prove himself worthy of their legacy. But Marissa, his expression softened slightly. Marissa was different. Different how? She complied outwardly, but I could see her struggling with it. The first year I was there, she participated like Michael did. But something changed. She started looking haunted. After rituals, she'd sometimes sneak down to the basement when her parents were asleep. Neil closed his eyes, seeming to draw strength from the memory. She'd bring me water, extra food when she could, clean some of my wounds. Once she brought me a blanket, but took it back before morning so her parents wouldn't notice. I made notes, trying to picture the teenage girl from the crime scene photos, Copper hair, freckles across her nose, eyes that seemed too old, performing small acts of rebellion in a house of horrors. Did she ever explain why she was helping you? Not at first. She hardly spoke. But over time, she started whispering things while she tended to me, said she was sorry, that she didn't think it was right anymore. Neil's voice cracked. Last winter, she told me she wanted to help me escape, but she was terrified of what her father would do if he caught her. Were there others before you? Neil nodded, eyes still closed. Many. I never saw most of them, just heard them. The screaming. His breathing quickened. Sometimes, Harold would bring them down to show me what would happen if I didn't cooperate with their rituals. They never lasted long. And the night of the killings, I prompted gently. Can you tell me what happened? Neil opened his eyes, gaze distant as if watching a film play out against the hospital ceiling. It was after a ceremony they called the cleansing. Usually they only performed it on captives, but that night was different. Harold said the smiling ones had spoken to him, told him Michael wasn't showing proper devotion, that he needed to be purified. Neil's heart monitor beeped faster. They made Michael kneel in the center of the room. Harold and Evelyn took turns cutting symbols into his chest and back while reciting passages from their book. I thought of the teenager's body. The ritualistic cuts that the coroner had noted were still fresh at time of death. Michael screamed at first, then just went silent. His eyes rolled back. I thought he might be dead, but Harold checked his pulse and said the vessel was prepared but needed rest. They carried him upstairs. Neil paused, taking a shuddering breath. After they all went to bed, Marissa came down to the basement. She was shaking. Said she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't watch them hurt her brother like that. She slipped something into my hand. A razor blade she'd taken from her father's shaving kit. He held up his right hand, turning it as if he could still see the blade there. She told me to wait until everyone was asleep, that the ritual had exhausted her parents. They'd be in a deeper sleep than usual. And did you wait? Until the house was completely silent. Took nearly 2 hours to cut through the restraints on my wrists. Neil's expression hardened. When I got free, I didn't run, not right away. 3 years of watching them torture and kill people. 3 years in that cage. I wanted revenge, I supplied quietly. Justice, Neil corrected, though something flashed behind his eyes that made me think my word had been more accurate. I went to their bedroom first. Harold was closest to the door. Neil's voice became mechanical, emotionless. I cut his throat before he fully woke. He tried to call out, but all that came out was a gurgling sound. Evelyn started to scream, so I stabbed her in the throat too. The coroner's report noted more extensive injuries than that, I said carefully. Neil's face remained expressionless. After they were dead, I did to them what they had done to others. Cut the smile into Evelyn's face. Opened Harold's chest the way he'd shown me so many times on other victims. Arranged things the way they arranged their sacrifices. He delivered these details with chilling detachment, as if reciting a grocery list rather than describing brutal mutilations he'd performed. And the children? I asked, noticing how his heart monitor spiked slightly. I went to their rooms next. Michael was still unconscious from the ritual. Neil hesitated for the first time. I made it quick for him. Didn't want him to suffer more. Cut his throat while he slept. Same with Marissa. Something in his delivery felt wrong. The hesitation. The sudden compression of details after the methodical description of killing the parents. That doesn't match what we found, Neil. The children were decapitated, their heads arranged to face each other. Neil blinked rapidly. Right, yes. After I killed them, I was still in a kind of frenzy, wanted to make a statement, to do to all of them what they'd done to others. Including Marissa, the girl who helped you, who gave you the razor blade. His fingers twisted more violently in the blanket. She was still one of them, still participated in the killings, for years. One moment of kindness doesn't erase that. I let the silence stretch, watching Neil's face. Something wasn't adding up. The detachment with which he described mutilating the parents versus the obvious discomfort when discussing the children's deaths. The inconsistency about how he killed them. Neil, forensics found defensive wounds on Marissa's hands and arms, splinters under her fingernails from clawing at the floorboards. I kept my voice gentle despite the grotesque details. She wasn't killed in her sleep. She fought. His heart monitor jumped erratically. You don't understand. You weren't there for 3 years. You didn't see what they did. I believe you about what the Carvers did, I assured him. I found their book. I've read enough to understand what you endured was beyond imagination. I'm just trying to get a complete picture of what happened that night. Neil's breathing steadied slightly. It's hard to remember everything clearly. I was weak, running on adrenaline after years of starvation. Some of it blurs together. I nodded, not pushing further for the moment. Tell me more about the family's beliefs. You mentioned the smiling ones. What exactly did the Carvers think they were doing? This safer topic seemed to calm him. Neil leaned back against his pillows. They believed they were preparing for some kind of awakening, that when enough vessels had been created, the smiling ones would return to our world. Harold said his family had been chosen centuries ago as keepers of the doctrine, that there were others like them spread across the country. This aligned with what I'd found in the journal, references to sister families and keeper bloodlines. Did they ever mention specific locations? Other families by name? Harold talked about gatherings sometimes, places in Wyoming, Montana, mentioned cousins in Oregon. Neil's expression darkened. They traveled every few years for what they called convergences. Left me locked in the basement for days, always came back, energized, ready for new rituals. I wrote down the locations, making mental notes to cross-reference them with the journal. One more thing, Neil. The night of the killings. Was anything unusual happening? Any special ritual or event planned? Neil's eyes fixed on mine with sudden intensity. Harold had been excited all week, said a convergence was coming, that an important phase was beginning. He licked his dry lips. The morning before it happened, he came down to the basement alone, told me I should be honored, that I'd survived longer than any other vessel, that I was finally ready. Ready for what? He never said exactly, but that night, during Michael's ritual, Harold kept saying, the circle must be complete, that all vessels must be aligned. Neil's voice dropped to a whisper. I think they were planning to kill me that night, as part of whatever was coming. The timing nagged at me, Neil's miraculous escape occurring precisely when the family was preparing for some significant event. We talked for another hour, Neil filling in details about the Carvers' daily routines, their ritualistic behaviors, the pattern of abductions and killings. His account was exhaustive and largely matched the physical evidence we'd gathered, but those inconsistencies about the children's deaths continued to trouble me. By the time I left, afternoon had faded to evening. Captain Dale was waiting for me in the hospital parking lot, leaning against his unmarked car with 2 coffee cups in hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, passing me one. "How's our miracle survivor?" I took a long swallow of the bitter hospital coffee. "Physically improving, mentally." I shook my head. He provided a complete account of what happened. Most of it checks out against the evidence. "Most of it?" Dale raised an eyebrow. "There are inconsistencies in how he describes killing the children, particularly the girl, Marissa." I leaned against the car beside Dale, suddenly feeling the weight of the week's investigation. "He claims he killed them quickly in their sleep, but the forensic evidence suggests otherwise." "Not surprising his memory's fragmented after what he endured," Dale pointed out. "Trauma does that." "Maybe." I wasn't convinced. "There's something else. According to Neil, Marissa was questioning her family's beliefs, even helped him escape by giving him the razor blade. If that's true, why kill her? And why be dishonest about how he did it?" Dale sighed heavily. "Because it complicates the narrative. Self-defense against monstrous captors is clean. Killing a teenager who helped you escape, even one raised in a death cult, that's messier." Rain started falling more heavily, drumming on the roof of the car. "The DA's already indicated they won't be pressing charges," Dale continued. 3 years of documented torture and captivity. Clear evidence of the family's involvement in multiple homicides. Neil Simmons acted to save his own life after enduring conditions few could imagine. Case closed. Is it? I stared into my coffee. What about the journal I found? The references to other families practicing the same rituals? The missing persons cases that might be connected? That's a different investigation. Dale placed a hand on my shoulder. You've done good work here, Reynolds. But you came out of retirement for one case, not a multi-state cult conspiracy. Let the FBI take over that angle. He was right, logically. Yet something kept pulling me back to those inconsistencies in Neil's story. The defensive wounds on Marissa's arms, the splinters under her fingernails, the hesitation in Neil's voice when describing her death compared to the clinical detachment when discussing the parents. I'll submit my final report tomorrow, I said finally. But I want to review the forensics on the children one more time. Dale nodded, knowing better than to push. Just remember, whatever Neil Simmons did that night, it came after 3 years of hell at the hands of those people. Sometimes survival is messy. I drove back to my motel through the rain, Dale's words echoing in my head alongside Neil's account. The windshield wipers created a hypnotic rhythm that matched the questions pulsing through my thoughts. Why would Neil lie about killing someone who helped him? What really happened to Marissa Carver? And if Neil wasn't telling the truth about that night, what else might he be hiding? I wrapped up the Carver investigation in exactly 14 days. The final report wasn't my most thorough work. It left questions unanswered and threads loose, but it satisfied the bureaucratic requirements. That was all Captain Dale had asked for when he'd called me out of retirement. You're officially done, Dale said, taking the folder from my hands. We stood in the small conference room of the Pinecrest Police Department, surrounded by case photos I'd been studying for hours. The DA reviewed everything this morning. No charges against Simmons. Self-defense after prolonged captivity and torture. I nodded, glancing at the crime scene photos spread across the table. Harold Carver's mutilated chest, Evelyn's grotesque carved smile, the children's heads arranged as if in conversation. Something still doesn't sit right, I said. Dale sighed, collecting the photos into a neat stack. Because nothing about this case is right, Reynolds. It's a nightmare from start to finish. He paused, studying my face. Go home, Get back to that retirement you were just starting to enjoy. Fish. Read books that aren't about serial killers. Forget this place. I packed up my notes while Dale boxed the case materials for archiving. My rental car sat alone in the police station lot as evening settled over Pinecrest. The small town looked innocent in the fading light, just another rural outpost serving the hunting cabins and summer homes scattered through the surrounding wilderness. No outward sign of the horror that had unfolded in those woods. Within an hour, I was on the highway heading south, passing the same fog-shrouded mountains I'd driven through 2 weeks earlier. Then, I'd been summoned to investigate a crime. Now I was supposedly leaving it behind. But the Carver case traveled with me. 3 nights after returning home, I woke with my sheets soaked in sweat, gasping for breath. In my dream, I'd been back in that basement, discovering Neil in his cage. But when I opened the door, Evelyn Carver emerged instead, her face split in that carved smile, whispering, "The circle must be complete." I stared at my ceiling until dawn, knowing sleep wouldn't return. For 5 consecutive nights, similar nightmares haunted me. Sometimes I faced Harold, his chest cavity open and arranged in ritual patterns. Sometimes the children's disembodied heads whispered to each other as I passed. But most often it was Evelyn, her carved smile stretching impossibly wide as she told me, "You freed the wrong one." By the 6th night, I gave up on normal sleep. Instead, I sat up at my dining room table with my laptop and the copies I'd made of key case documents. If my subconscious wouldn't let this go, perhaps conscious investigation would provide answers. I started with Harold's journal, The Doctrine of Eternal Smiles. I'd photographed every page before submitting it as evidence. The images on my screen seemed almost harmless compared to the physical object with its human leather binding and blood-brown ink. Reading with fresh eyes, I noticed references I'd overlooked before. The Keeper families maintain our sacred duty across the divided lands. Though separated by distance, we remain joined in purpose. The vessels we prepare clear the path for their return. Another passage mentioned specific locations. The northwestern keepers gather at the summer solstice, the southwestern at winter. The central family maintains the calendar and notifies all when alignments approach. I created a map marking locations referenced directly or indirectly in the journal. Then I began searching unsolved homicides in those areas with keywords like ritualistic, smile, and facial mutilation. The results disturbed me far more than I'd anticipated. Jasper, Wyoming, 2008. A family of 4 found murdered in their isolated home. Parents with chest cavities opened, children decapitated. Oak Ridge, Montana, 2011. 3 hikers discovered in a cave, faces carved from mouth to ears in what authorities described as smile-like lacerations. Elkmont, Oregon, 2014. A rural family disappeared after police discovered a hidden room in their basement containing restraints and dried blood evidence from at least 9 individuals. By morning, my dining room wall displayed a makeshift investigation board. Crime scene photos, journal excerpts, newspaper clippings, all connected with red string. The pattern was undeniable. The Carvers weren't isolated fanatics. They were part of something larger, more organized, spanning decades and state lines. I sat back, rubbing my burning eyes. The deeper I dug, the more connections emerged. How had law enforcement missed this? The answer came quickly. Jurisdictional boundaries, overworked departments, cases filed away once leads went cold. No one had been looking at the bigger picture. My phone rang, startling me. Dale's name flashed on the screen. "Retirement treating you well?" he asked when I answered. "Getting there," I lied, staring at my wall of horrors. Good. Listen, Simmons has been asking for you. Doctors say he's been increasingly agitated, keeps talking about things watching him through the mirrors. I hesitated. The sensible thing would be to refer him to the FBI. Let them deal with the keeper families and their ritual killings. Let them interview Neil about the broader conspiracy his captors were part of. But the memory of those amber eyes looking up at me from that cage wouldn't let me walk away. Tell the hospital I'll be there tomorrow, I said. Pinecrest Regional Hospital looked different in daylight. Less institutional, more like what it was. A community medical center that normally handled farming accidents and skiing injuries, not the lone survivor of a torture cult. Neil had been moved from intensive care to the psychiatric wing. His room was larger, but still felt clinical, with its observation window and sparse furnishings. He sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the mountains. 2 weeks of proper nutrition and medical care had put some flesh on his bones, but he remained gaunt, his hospital gown hanging loose around his shoulders. "You came back," he said without turning, just like he had during my last visit. "You asked for me," I replied, settling into the chair opposite him. Neil turned then, his amber eyes still unnervingly intense despite the dark circles beneath them. "They don't believe me, the doctors, when I tell them about the watching." "The watching?" "Through the mirrors, the glass." He gestured toward the window. "When the light hits it just right, they can see through. They're looking for me." I kept my expression neutral. "Who's looking for you, Neil?" "The others, the ones like them." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The other keeper families." My pulse quickened. I hadn't mentioned my research to anyone, certainly not to Neil. "What do you know about other families?" I asked carefully. Harold talked about them, said they were scattered but connected, that they all served the same purpose. Neil's fingers twisted in the fabric of his gown. "When they took me to the basement, I wasn't the only one. There was another cage, another man, older. He'd been there longer. He told me things before they killed him." This was new information. Nothing in Neil's previous statements mentioned another captive. "What kind of things?" "About the families, their history, how they've been doing this for centuries." Neil leaned forward. He said they believe they're creating doorways, that the cutting, the smile, it opens something inside a person, makes room for other things to come through. I thought of the journal passages about preparing vessels and clearing the path for their return. Did Harold ever mention specific locations? Other family names? Neil's gaze slid away. Sometimes. When he thought I was unconscious, he'd talk to Evelyn about gatherings, places in Wyoming, Montana, names like Blackwood and Thorn. I mentally matched these against the cases I'd found. The Wyoming murders had been of a family named Blackwood. The hikers in Montana had been found on Thorn Ridge. "Neil, I need you to understand something important." I leaned forward to meet his eyes. "I believe you. About the other families. The connections. I've been researching since the investigation ended, and I've found evidence supporting what you're saying." Something flickered across his face. Relief? Validation? Concern? It passed too quickly to read. "Then you know I'm not safe here," he said. "They have ways of finding people who know about them." The man in the other cage, he said they hunted him across 3 states after he escaped a family in Idaho. "You're under protection here," I assured him. "No one can get to you." Neil laughed, a hollow, jarring sound. "You still don't fully understand. It's not just people. It's what works through them, what watches through them." He tapped his temple. "The cutting opens doors, Detective, not just in skin. The psychiatric staff had diagnosed Neil with severe PTSD, dissociative episodes, and possible psychotic features resulting from prolonged trauma. His medical chart noted delusions about being watched and paranoia regarding reflective surfaces. The rational part of me wanted to attribute his claims to these conditions, but the journal entries, the connected cases, the specificity of details he'd never been told. I visited Neil 3 times that week. Each time, his physical health had improved while his mental state seemed increasingly fragile. He refused to have mirrors in his room and covered the observation window with a blanket when staff weren't looking. During my 3rd visit, I found him pressed into the corner of his room, eyes fixed on the ceiling light fixture. "They're coming soon," he whispered when I entered. "I can feel them getting closer." "Who, Neil?" "The ones who continued what the Carvers started." His eyes never left the light fixture. "They know I escaped, know I killed their bloodkin. They're gathering to find me." I spent that evening in my motel room, reviewing my notes and the journal photographs. One passage caught my attention that I'd previously overlooked. When a keeper bloodline is broken, the nearest family must reclaim their vessels and continue their work. The circle must remain unbroken. If other keeper families existed, and they adhered to this doctrine, then Neil's paranoia might have a foundation. Not supernatural watching through mirrors, perhaps, but very human cultists seeking to reclaim what they saw as their property, or exact revenge for the death of fellow believers. I called Dale late that night. "I think Neil might need additional security," I explained. "If the Carvers were part of a larger network." "Reynolds," Dale interrupted, his voice weary. "We've been through this. The FBI has the journal. They're investigating potential connections. That's not our jurisdiction anymore. But Neil is safe in a secure psychiatric facility under 24-hour observation." Dale sighed. "Look, I get it. This case got under your skin, but you need to step back. For your own sanity." After hanging up, I stared at my motel ceiling, mind racing. Dale was right about jurisdiction, about stepping back, about all the logical reasons to let this go. But logic hadn't followed me into the Carver basement. It hadn't been waiting in that cage for 3 years. And it wasn't what drove me back to the hospital the next morning, determined to press Neil for more specific information about the other families. I arrived at 9:17 a.m., signed in at the psychiatric ward's secure entrance, and followed the familiar path to Neil's room. The door was open, the bed was empty, sheets neatly made. No sign of Neil's few possessions. "Mr. Simmons had his morning medication about an hour ago," a nurse explained when I asked. "He should be in his room or the common area." We searched both. Then the bathrooms, the therapy rooms, the small courtyard where patients could get fresh air. Neil Simmons had vanished. Hospital security reviewed the camera footage. Neil had been recorded walking down the main corridor toward the common area at 8:22 a.m. He never appeared on any other camera. No alarms had been triggered. No exterior doors showed signs of forced exit. "This isn't possible," the security director insisted, rewinding the footage again. "He can't just disappear." But he had. While staff conducted a full facility search, I returned to Neil's room, examining it more thoroughly. The neatly made bed, the nightstand with its paper cup of water and pill cup showing he'd taken his morning medication, the small closet containing the clothes that had been provided for him, still hanging untouched. I checked under the mattress, behind the nightstand, inside the air vent. When I pulled back the blanket on the bed, I found it, a folded piece of paper addressed simply to Reynolds. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "They are still watching me. I can see them now in every reflection, every shadow." I have to go find them before they find me. Thank you for saving me, but this isn't over. What the Carvers started doesn't end with their deaths. The smile is waiting for all of us. N. A cold sensation spread through my chest as I read the words. Neil hadn't been taken. He had fled, driven by paranoia, trauma, or something else entirely. And somehow he had managed to escape a secure facility without appearing on a single camera. I pocketed the note before security returned. They didn't need to see it. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out what it meant. Later that day, as local police organized a search for the missing patient, I stood alone in the hospital parking lot. The mountains surrounded Pinecrest like silent sentinels, wilderness stretching in every direction. Neil could be anywhere by now, driven by delusions or genuine fear, or something else entirely. I remembered the inconsistencies in his account of the Carver murders, the specific details about rituals that matched Harold's journal exactly, the way he'd described mutilating his captors with clinical precision. A terrible thought formed. What if Neil hadn't just been the Carver's victim? What if 3 years of captivity and indoctrination had transformed him into something else? Something that understood their beliefs from the inside? As I drove back to my motel, I made a decision. I wouldn't be returning to retirement. Not until I found Neil Simmons. Not until I understood what the smile truly meant. Not until I knew whether I had saved a victim or released something the Carvers had created. The official investigation was closed. Mine was just beginning. 6 months had passed since I stood in that empty hospital room holding Neil's goodbye note. 6 months since I'd made my decision not to return to retirement. The official investigation was closed, but mine had consumed me entirely. My living room no longer resembled a place where people relaxed. I'd pushed my couch against the wall to make space for 3 large cork boards arranged in a U-shape. Red string connected crime scene photos to newspaper clippings to maps. Stacks of case files from 5 different states surrounded my laptop like paper sentinels. Coffee cups in various states of emptiness marked my territories of focus. I'd spent weeks digging into property records for the Carver cabin. What I discovered painted a disturbing pattern. Before the Carvers, the property had been owned by the Hendersons for 4 years. During their residency, 3 hikers had vanished in the surrounding woods. Before them, the Wilsons had lived there for 6 years, coinciding with the disappearances of a local teenager and a park ranger. Each family had moved away without explanation. Each had been described by neighbors as keeping to themselves. Tracking the previous owners had led me down a rabbit hole of similar properties in remote locations across the Northwest. Isolated homes, families who kept to themselves, mysterious disappearances. It was like watching the same story play out with different characters, different settings, but always the same ending. "You need to let this go, Marcus," Sarah had told me during our last phone call 3 months ago. My sister had always been my anchor, the one person who could pull me back when I went too deep into a case. "This isn't healthy. It's not even your job anymore." "I can't," I'd replied, staring at the wall of horrors I'd assembled. "The Bureau is treating these as separate incidents. No one's connecting the dots." "Because maybe they aren't connected," she'd countered. "Maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't there because you can't accept that sometimes there are no answers." She'd stopped calling after that, or maybe I'd stopped answering. The days had begun to blur together. The first postcard arrived 4 months ago, plain white cardstock with a Wyoming postmark. No return address. No message except for a simple drawing of a smile. Not a happy face, just the curved line of a mouth. drawn with what looked like a felt-tip pen. I'd analyzed it for fingerprints, found nothing. I'd pinned it to the center of my investigation board. The second came a month later, postmarked from Livingston, Montana. The same blank card, the same hand-drawn smile. This time, the curve was slightly wider, extending farther toward where ears would be on a face. I couldn't tell if they were from Neil or someone else. Part of me hoped they were from Neil, proof he was alive at least. Another part dreaded what that might mean. Detective Sorensen from my old department had stopped by twice. The first time to check on me, the second time to tell me they were concerned. "This isn't a wellness check," she'd said, standing awkwardly in my doorway, taking in the transformation of my living room. "This is an intervention. Everyone's worried, Marcus." "I'm fine," I'd insisted. "You're not fine. You've gone full beautiful mind in here." She gestured to the web of string and photos. "Dale thinks you need psychiatric evaluation." "Dale called me out of retirement for this case," I'd reminded her. "He doesn't get to decide when I'm done with it. The case is closed. Neil Simmons disappeared from a psychiatric facility. His medical records show severe trauma and delusional thinking. He's either dead or living off the grid somewhere." "No," I'd said, pointing to the postcards. "He's sending messages, and I think he's hunting." That was the last time anyone from the department visited. The third postcard arrived yesterday, postmarked Helena, Montana. The smile drawn on it extended fully from ear to ear, with small vertical lines at each end suggesting cuts. I'd stared at it for hours, turning it over and over in my hands like a talisman, searching for hidden meaning. The storm hit around midnight. Rain lashed against my windows as thunder rattled the frames. I sat at my desk, comparing reports of missing persons along Neil's apparent route north, Wyoming to Montana. Sleep wasn't an option anymore, not with the images that waited behind my closed eyelids. My phone rang at 2:37 a.m. The screen showed an unknown number with a Montana area code. I answered immediately. "Reynolds." Silence. Then the soft sound of breathing. "Who is this?" I demanded, though I already knew. I recognized the slight wheeze on the inhale, the same sound Neil made when he was anxious during our interviews. The breathing continued for long seconds. I reached for a pen, ready to write down the number and track it. "Neil," I said quietly. "I know it's you." Another few breaths. Then, in a whisper so faint I had to press the phone hard against my ear. I found more of them. The smile is spreading. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately. The number was no longer in service. I made a note of it anyway, adding it to my map with the time and date. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours of darkness reviewing my files on the Keeper families, seeking patterns in their movements, their victims, their rituals. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent that follows heavy rain. At dawn, I drove to the convenience store 3 blocks away for coffee and a newspaper, one of my few remaining connections to normal routine. The headline on the front page of the national section stopped me cold. "Family of 4 found dead in ritual killing near Helena, Montana." The coffee slipped from my hand, splashing across the store's linoleum floor. I barely noticed as I scanned the article. "Discovered yesterday morning by a postal worker delivering a package. Faces mutilated with what investigators described as smile-like cutting. Children's bodies arranged in ritual pattern. Authorities looking into possible cult connections." The article included a photo of the family from happier times, the Blackwoods, parents in their 40s, 2 children under 12. They'd owned a remote property outside Helena for the past 5 years. Back in my apartment, I pinned the newspaper article to my board and stepped back, seeing the pattern with horrible clarity. Neil's call had come from Helena, hours after a family with carved smiles had been discovered. "I found more of them," he'd said. Neil Simmons hadn't escaped the psychological torment of his captivity. He had embraced it. Somehow, during those 3 years in that cage, the carver's beliefs had infected him. He didn't run from the hospital because he was afraid of being found. He ran because he had work to do. I sat heavily in my desk chair, the weight of responsibility crushing down on me. I had pulled Neil from that basement. I had advocated for him. I had believed his story about killing the carvers in self-defense, despite the inconsistencies. What if the carvers hadn't been planning to kill Neil that night? What if they'd been planning to initiate him? "The circle must be complete," Harold had reportedly said during Michael's ritual. Neil had told me he believed they were preparing to kill him. But what if completing the circle meant something else? What if it meant Neil's transformation was nearly finished? I thought about the journal. The Doctrine of Eternal Smiles, with its references to vessels being prepared. What if Neil had become exactly what the carvers intended, a new vessel for their beliefs? My gun and badge sat in their case on my bookshelf, untouched since retirement. I retrieved them now, checking the weapon methodically before securing it in my shoulder holster. I packed a small bag with essentials, then called the airline to book a flight to Montana. As I moved through my apartment gathering what I'd need, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back at me looked haunted. Gray hair unkempt, eyes shadowed from months of insufficient sleep, face lined with the weight of a case that wouldn't let me go. I had told Neil he was safe, that the carvers could no longer hurt him. I'd been wrong. Their physical bodies were gone, but what they'd planted in his mind had taken root, blossomed into something monstrous. Neil was out there, leaving a trail of carved smiles in his wake, and I was the one who had freed him. The evil from that cabin hadn't died with the carvers. It had found a new home in Neil, the perfect vessel. A man who had been forced to understand their beliefs intimately, who had witnessed their rituals firsthand, who had endured years of their indoctrination. And now he was continuing their work, perhaps even expanding it. As I loaded my bag into my car and started the drive to the airport, I knew with grim certainty that what I had discovered in Pinecrest 6 months ago wasn't an ending. It was merely the beginning of something far worse. I wasn't just hunting Neil Simmons. I was hunting the legacy of the carvers, a legacy that had existed long before them and would continue unless I stopped it. The knowledge sat like lead in my stomach as I drove toward the airport, toward Montana, toward whatever horror awaited me there.